Hello my disciples, Father Andrew here. Today I'm going to be talking about 5 cryptids from the Trelonga homeworld, and the lore surrounding them. But before I do, I just want to say I hope you're enjoying Spooky Month, and I am pre-recording this on the 26th of September while I still have a cold. But anyway, getting right into it. Starting with our first cryptid, we have the Marrow Haunter. Stories of these creatures originating from the tribal days of the Trelongan species. These creatures feed, as the name implies, on bone marrow, and according to the legend, if bones were left unattended around the camp, these creatures would come, crack the bones open, and feed on the bone marrow. These creatures were seen not really as a bad omen or a good omen, they were just a thing that would show up and steal, well, what's potential food from the camp if it was left unattended. But there's more to these creatures than just that. It is said that they whistle by blowing air through their proboscis, or proboscis, however you want to pronounce it, basically the thing it uses to suck out the bone marrow from bones, and these creatures were exceptionally shy, preferring to stay away from the Trelongans and anything else that tried to approach them. And it's also said in the legends that these creatures are twice the size of a Trelonga, but there are also a few interesting stories involving these creatures. One of them I'll now give a basic summary of. Essentially, a youngling who was out exploring and had a pack of food with him, found one of these creatures starving to death deep in a cave, and was initially hesitant to approach it at first, but quickly came to realise that it wasn't hostile, and also realising that the creature was starving, decided to take out some food from his pack, which was basically compacted bone marrow mixed with fat, shoved inside a long piece of bone that had been sealed up with lard, and capped off with pieces of leather, and he gave it to the creature to eat. Thankful for this gift, the creature dug around in a pile of bones, pulled out a small animal skull, gave it to the youngling as a gift, nodded, and then proceeded to walk off into the caves. The story also describes that the creature had a distinct set of scars on both its face and chest, specifically ones that looked almost like a grindworm had slammed into it. But anyway, many years after this, when the youngling had grown up and had become a man, he and his girlfriend were down in the caves exploring, looking for a specific type of mushroom, one that they planned to make a stew with, but in the process had gotten themselves turned around and lost. They spent a good few hours roaming around the caves trying to find their way back, but were certainly lost. They had ended up in a part of the cave section they straight up just could not recognise. So they called out for help and tried to see if anyone was around, only for the exact same Marrow Haunter that he remembered as a youngling to carefully emerge from the bush and look at him with a expression of, "Hold on, I recognise you." And the guy saw the scars on this thing and instantly recognised it, that this was the creature he fed as a youngling. His girlfriend was rightfully spooked by seeing this thing, she had never seen a Marrow Haunter before, but he reassured her, recognising the creature. The thing came out, it nodded, and he explained to it that they were lost. The creature simply, as the story says, proceeded to nod several times, approached him, grabbed him by the hand, and proceeded to gently take them back to where their tribe was. Once it brought them into familiar territory, it came to stop several miles from the actual tribe, simply looked at him, nodded, whistled lightly, looked in the direction where the tribe was, nodded again, and let go before just walking off, almost as if the creature knew that they were on the right path. The man simply says thank you to the creature, it looks back at him, nods one more time, looks up into the air and lets out a high-pitched, almost joyful whistle before looking at him, nodding its head violently several times, and then running off deep into the caves again. And that is in summary the events of the story. This story seeming to imply that these creatures live a long time and can seemingly remember faces. And not only that, but seem to have a higher level of intelligence than some basic animal. I'd honestly say the intelligence of these creatures is probably something like an orangutan or higher, but definitely not human. But anyway, outside of the actual stories of these creatures, there's very little evidence of these creatures ever existing apart from the occasional cave drawing, and stories like the aforementioned one, among many others. But interestingly enough, stories of these creatures come to a complete stop after the tribal age comes to an end and the actual formation of underground civilization starts to begin. It's also worth noticing that the Deep Ones, they don't have any stories of these creatures at all because the Deep Ones simply did not exist at this time. the deep ones being more mentioned on page 88 of the Gospel. So it is possible that perhaps the Marrow Haunter, in theory, was a species that existed, but the Trelungans actually advancing and spreading throughout the planet pushed these creatures further and further back, resulting in a loss of habitat and them eventually going extinct. This combined with the tribes no longer actually leaving bones laying around and moving on to more secure structures led to a lack of food sources and then potentially starving. Which makes sense because I cannot imagine a carrion feeder that big being a species that would live very long. Anyway, now to move on to the next creature. We have one that actually physically existed. A giant, legendary albino male sky terror known as the White Death. The legend of this creature is incredibly simple. Unlike the regular sky terrors that would occasionally attack farms so they could eat the cattle, oh yeah, for context, this happened after pillar trees had been set up along the equator, making the planet more livable, and the Trelunga species had actually started building infrastructure on the surface. Anyway, getting back into it, unlike the aforementioned regular sky terrors, the White Death was particularly aggressive. Sometimes this thing would show up to farms not just to kill the cattle so it could eat them, but literally just to grief the farmers, slaughtering entire herds of cattle, smashing down sheds, and generally just digging up the ground and making it an absolute fucking mess. The White Terror would do absolutely anything to fuck up any farm it came across, seemingly for no other reason than pure malice. In fact, here's a very quick story giving an example, an almost comical one if it weren't so fucked up. This thing, apparently from the evidence they found, it sat on top of a farmer's house, waited for him to come out early in the morning, and this thing was holding its shit for it must have been a good while, because when he came out, it dumped its entire intestinal tract's worth of shit directly on top of him, so violently that he was crushed and killed by the several hundred pounds of feces that this thing unloaded on him. Claw marks left in the roof and the fact that it was distinctly Sky Terror shit, making it pretty obvious what happened. The whole story being backed up by the whole community that lived around him as well, as pretty much everyone knew that the farmer there had personal beef with the White Death. Several times this thing had come to his farm, slaughtered all the cattle, and then simply fucked off, leaving all of them dead and none of them eaten, along with it having dug massive holes in the ground for no real reason other than just to piss him off even more. The legend of the White Death and the ridiculous amounts of trolling it did, probably driven by nothing but pure malice, went on for a good 33 years. 33 years of this thing showing up to random farms and slaughtering cattle and just being an absolute prick, only for then it to just completely fucking vanish with no trace. Yep, absolutely no trace. No body, no hunter having finally put the bastard down, nothing. Which left everyone in every community this thing touched completely baffled, completely bewildered how a creature that has spontaneously appeared and harassed communities for 33 years just vanished. And even weirder, that would never get solved. No body of the White Terror was ever found, and no other White Sky Terrors have ever been seen since. Which led to a few theories about the creature. Which actually I want to provide a bit of context on the actual behaviour of this creature and how people responded to it. It would prefer to regularly attack the same farms, often at night, seemingly to avoid getting shot at, and it seems to have a very abnormally high level of forward thinking and planning. So much that once farmers actually started tossing lead at this thing to try and get it to either cease existing or to go away, it would disappear for a while and target another farm a good distance away until the farm it was originally attacking would lower their guard, and then it would come back and continue to harass them. For context, the, pellet throwers that the Trelungans were using at this time were just like the ones we have today, except the ammunition they've always used has been the heavy spears that they used to punch through armor. I would like to do a video that goes in depth on Trelungan lead throwers, but I'm not sure if YouTube's gonna like that. Anyway, moving on. Anyway, back to the actual theories. The most commonly agreed theory is that this was just a freak product of nature, a Sky Terror male that was abnormally intelligent and just got lucky enough to be albino. Which albinism in the case of the Sky Terror results in completely black eyes. In fact, species related to the Sky Terror are also known to have completely black eyes when they suffer from albinism. But a less accepted theory, which is more actually present in the more spiritual communities of the Trelunga homeworld, is that the White Death was a being embodying the spirit of nature, and that it was incredibly unhappy about potentially the farmers and their, using of the land's resources. But it doesn't make sense that a thing that wants to protect nature would, slaughter the creatures that it was supposed to be protecting. And another theory even speculating that this was not a Sky Terror, but something using the compounded skeleton of a Sky Terror to pretend to be one and was some kind of demon. But those last two theories are pretty easily debunked by the fact that farmers who put lead through this thing did see it bleed and did hear it groan in pain. So this creature was indeed very corporeal and very biological. Yes, it bleeds, and that means they could indeed kill it. Well, they could if it stayed still long enough, but yeah, it disappeared. So yeah, that brings an end to this one, and we can move on to the next cryptid. Well, I should say cryptids, plural. Next up we have the Pebble People, who are essentially kind of the Trelungan homeworld equivalent of gnomes. Small magical creatures that would seemingly, according to legend, eat berries and carrion if they could find it, and were incredibly shy and would avoid contact. These creatures typically staying to deep thick woods and tall grasses and preferring to be left alone, sometimes even throwing their small spears if you got too close. These creatures did actually have a few stories where they were helpful, one of them helping a lost youngling find their way home after they got separated from their parents on a hiking trip, and then immediately skittering off after the parents spotted it. But again, there are, much like the first creature, no photos, but there are detailed drawings made by those who have apparently seen them, and they have been incredibly consistent. The creatures stand about a foot tall, they have limbs composed of what appear to be tree roots, and they have a very simple face, consisting of a small black mouth and two small eyes. Those who have encountered the creatures, or claim that the creatures communicate by what can only be described as some kind of language composed of organised babbling noises. Not babbling like an infant, but more like a babbling bird. Basically babbling bird noises. But anyway, it's said in the legends that these creatures live in hollow tree stumps, often in small families, and will dig out tunnels under the tree stump where they grow mushrooms as crops. Apart from that, that's all there really is to these little guys. Anyway, moving on to the next cryptid, we actually have a very special one. This being a species of predatory plant known as the Ripper Root, which is not a very well documented cryptid as there's not too many stories of them, but the stories are fairly consistent. Most of them involve a hunter going after a kill and him hunting it or chasing it, and then said animal getting violently ripped apart by these roots that rupture out of the ground. But there is one story that is slightly different, and that being a hunter who claims he was chased by these things. He was walking along a path when he felt vibrations in the ground behind him coming closer and stronger. He looked around to see these things bursting out of the ground, and they were coming towards him, like a cluster of them would burst up closer to him, and then the cluster behind would retract into the ground, and then re-emerge closer to him. So basically these things were like popping into the ground, getting closer, then bursting up, which absolutely rustled his jimmies, and so he ran and actually fired a few shots on these things and claims that he hit one, causing it to bleed a thick yellow sap, and that the plant audibly yelled out in what could only be described as a bellowing, disgusting, gurgling call of pain, and that seems to have deterred the attack of these plants. But when the hunter got back to his town and brung a hunting party up to show where the plants actually attacked him, they found only a slight yellow stain which they thought was piss from the smell, and the ground showed no signs of being disturbed, so they just didn't believe him. So yeah, there's sadly not much to this one. Again, there's no evidence that this species of plant exists. Anyway, now to move on to the next cryptid, we have the Crimson Jawheads, which, despite the fact there's no actual physical evidence showing these creatures exist, the consistency in stories from hunters who have seen these things, or actually more accurately have claimed to have seen these, is worth noting. Each story, even when they're incredibly detached from one another across the entire fucking planet, have described these creatures consistently the same way. These creatures are consistently described as resembling a jawhead, albeit They are deep red and their face resembles a skull, with two front-facing black eyes and white pupils. The antlers of the creature in question being lined with what can only be described as spikes, or more accurately teeth, from those who claimed to have been attacked by these creatures. These creatures are, interesting enough, also described as being able to mimic the voices of those around them. Throughout Trelungan history, there are plenty of stories of people going out into the woods in hunting groups and hearing voices being mimicked in the distance, hearing their friends' voices out in the woods when their friend is standing right next to them, even hearing their friend's voice telepathically calling out to them, which implies that, like the Trelunga, this species has telepathic abilities. And also there are stories of hunters getting ambushed by these things, and they've even come home with physical injuries from the attacks that these creatures gave them. Consistently, these stories involve them getting flanked or attacked from behind, and in some cases even surrounded, mobbed, knocked unconscious, beaten and bloodied, and then just left to bleed out and die. In fact, I'm going to retell you a story about a hunter who saw one of these things, albeit I'm summarising it to make it incredibly quick because this video is already quite long. Essentially, the hunter was up in his blind, and he was looking out on a clearing. He waited for a Jawhead to come out so that he could land a good shot on it, because he lived out in the woods, he lived in a cabin, that's how he got food. But then, in the distance he hears this distressed noise, a Jawhead clearly screaming in pain. Seconds later, it runs out into the clearing, completely covered in wounds, and is visibly distressed, like it's running from something. Only for a moment later, the Crimson Jawhead to run up behind it, slam its antlers around the Jawhead's neck, and with a single tug, slice the Jawhead's neck open, the thing dropping to the ground dead. The hunter, in complete disbelief, can only watch as the Crimson Jawhead rears up, stamps on the regular Jawhead's neck several times, breaking it, then proceeds to crouch down, listen to its breath like it was listening for it to die, and then proceeds to just start eating it on the spot with no hesitation. Completely confused, the hunter lets out a very muffled, "What the fuck?" Well, the Trelungan equivalent of what the fuck. I'm not really able to translate that directly between species. But anyway, then the thing stops and looks directly up at him, and that's when he sees the thing's face. The skeletal, almost Trelungan, skull-like face it has, albeit it lacks mandibles. The head just looking like an exposed skull. The eyes black with white, soul-piercing pupils. It then makes direct eye contact with him and simply repeats the exact same phrase he said, "What the fuck?" Literally just reacting on pure instinct, he levels his rifle and tries to take a shot at it, but it just misses entirely. He tries this several times, and the thing just walks up to his blind, looks up at him again, repeats, "What the fuck?" and then proceeds to just walk off into the woods, like nothing happened. Completely fucking terrified, the hunter waits for several hours to make sure that this thing is gone, listening to make sure that it's not out there. And while he's sitting there listening, waiting for it to go, he hears several times, "What the fuck?" out in the distance, progressively getting quieter as it goes further and further away. But after that, he goes home, tells his wife about it, he stays home and doesn't go hunting for a few more days just because he's paranoid of this fucking thing. Which, I'm gonna be honest, I don't blame him, I'd be doing the same. Actually, I wouldn't call it paranoid, that's perfectly reasonable to be scared of something that can mimic voices. But yeah, anyway, a few months after this, the wife goes into a nearby town and she talks to one of her friends, tells her about these things go by many different names. I like to call these things Crimson Deer because functionally they resemble a deer, so that's just what I'm gonna have to call them. I tried to call them Crimson Jawheads during this fucking recording, and I kept pissing it up. It's just so difficult to hold on to that name. Crimson Deer just makes more sense. Then again, I'm human, I'm not a Trelungan, so yeah. Anyway, with that we have covered our 5th cryptid. I'm sorry to have to bring the video to an end here, but this is really all the content I had for this video. I also want to elaborate on something real quick before I end this video, and that is like what actual region each one of these comes from. The first cryptid, the Marrow Haunter, the story of that actually, interesting enough, comes from the island of Con in the northwest. The story of the White Death comes from Neris, Kartrol, and Rakta, which are 3 major continents in the middle of the Trelunga homeworld map. Those little pebble fellas are from the Froll Islands and from the island of Cartroll. The violent predatory underground plant is from the island of Linqua up in the north, and also from Rakta. But all the stories come from Linqua, that final story came from Rakta. And the stories of the Crimson Jawhead are interesting enough from Rakta, Neris, Cartroll, and Froll mainly. In fact, there's only one country on the Trelonga homeworld with next to no stories about these creatures, and that is Romph, and that's probably because of how icy it is. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. See you in the next one. Have a great day, my disciples, and have a happy Halloween.